There's no way I can infect you, I assure you. Had the vaccine. I just answer your questions if you want. I mean, we're here obviously at this great local business, small business founded here, growing. And I just continue to believe that small business is critical for our economy and its future. It's a source of employment. People working here today that wouldn't have a job if these guys didn't exist. And as they continue to grow, they'll create more opportunity. And it's been the last year's been a big challenge for small businesses, which is why, the Paycheck Protection Program that I wrote and that we were able to put into law has been so critical for all kinds of businesses across the country and the state. And millions of jobs that were saved as a result of it. And it's a program that will continue to the end of May, and one that I think has been one of the most important achievements of all the things that we've done on COVID. So. Sí, en español, lo que está aquí apagó la luz. No, una pequeña empresa Eat Fresco, que realmente es una compañía que crea empleo para más de 100 personas que trabajan aquí, están creciendo, una compañía bastante nueva, pero un ejemplo de por qué los pequeños comerciantes son tan importantes para el futuro de este país y de nuestra economía. Y es por eso que yo tengo tanto orgullo en la ley PPP, que yo fui el autor, que pudimos lograr. Creo que ha sido la intervención del gobierno más importante que se ha hecho en el último año durante la pandemia.
Senator, obviously we're keeping, good to see you by the way, welcome to Tampa. Obviously we're keeping all a very close eye on what's happening in Manatee County. As you, I'm sure well know, there are about half of all the gyp stacks in the United States are here in Florida. Do you believe that this is a case, that this shows that that the EPA needs to do more to have oversight over these gyp stacks and crack down on regulation?
Well, I mean, this one site in particular has been a ticking time bomb, and look, I think from my conversation with the sheriff a little while ago, it appears the worst is going to be avoided, but there's still going to be some negative implications to these releases. As far as what the federal role can be, I mean, this is primarily a state responsibility. I think there's time now moving forward to sort of take that into account. But I don't think what's happening now is a surprise. This is a site that everyone knew was problematic. It was an inherited site that's changed hands a few times. But eventually, that piper is going to have to be paid. I mean, you're going to reach a moment like what was reached here. And I think once we've passed this sort of moment of crisis, is an opportunity to sort of examine it more holistically at the other sites that are out there. And to the extent the federal government can be a part of being of assistance, it's certainly something we'll consider. But right now our focus is making sure that if they needed any federal assistance, it would be available to the state and the local government.
Do you believe that this is an example of the failure of state government?
No, this is a site that's, as I said, I recall correctly, it's 4 decades in the making in terms of the situation it's now in. It was a known risk factor for a long time. There had not been a lot of clarity as to what to do about it in the long-term solution available for it. So I don't think it took anybody by surprise, and the notification that came to the state, I believe, on Thursday and to the local authorities, I thought the state responded to pretty quickly and avoided the worst case scenario. But ultimately, this is one of those things that people knew was a ticking time bomb. I don't think the issue is the state. I think the issue is where do you put it? Where do you send this? What do you do with it? There isn't a lot of places out there welcoming the receipt of contaminated material.
Senator, might the situation in Piney Point lead you and Senator Republican colleagues to maybe reconsider working with the White House on their infrastructure plan?
Well, I want to work on an infrastructure plan as long as it's about infrastructure. I mean, the challenge I have with what the White House has put forward is redefining infrastructure beyond what we normally have defined it to be. And but I think if the White House wants to have a bipartisan infrastructure plan, they can most certainly have one. It'll cost money, a lot of money, but it's something this country needs and something that enjoys broad bipartisan support. And to the extent there are things in there beneficial to Florida, be it the Everglades or the situation in Manatee County, it's certainly something we'll consider. So I don't think there's anybody against an infrastructure plan. I think the problem I have is when you call something infrastructure, but add to it all kinds of programs that belong outside the role of infrastructure. And where some people want this thing to cost $8 to $10 trillion. I think that's the challenge. So I hope we can get back to a conversation about infrastructure. That'll be very expensive, but important for the country, because I think you can get 90 votes for something like that.
So we haven't really seen you here in Tampa since this pandemic in the past year. Just how close have you been monitoring what's been going on here? We know more than 2 million infections in this state, close to 35,000 people have died. How would you rate your state's response to how it's handling this pandemic that's cost so many lives and done so
The state of Florida?
Yeah, how would you assess the response of the state?
Well, I think the state of Florida needs to be judged by, the first thing I tell you is that one of the things we did in deciding to go around the state or not is whatever the local, out of respect for what local authorities were mandating. So 6 months ago, I'm not sure we would all be in this room because the local governments had restrictions that were different in different places. So I think the state's decision to provide a significant amount of autonomy to local governments in the early days was the right decision. I think the moment came where the governor had to make a decision about balancing the costs and the benefits of these measures, the cost of going back to school versus the benefits of going back to school, the cost of reopening businesses versus the benefit of reopening businesses, and I think they struck the right balance. And the evidence is that if you look at our numbers, they're better than New York, they're comparable to California's in terms of the infections, and it's a terrible tragedy. One death is too many, one serious hospitalization is too many, but this is a pandemic that's challenged the whole country. But by comparison, while our infection numbers and our death numbers per 100,000 are better than New York and comparable to California, our economic numbers are substantially better than both. So this is a difficult situation, but at some point you have to balance a combination of factors that includes people's need to feed their family and keep their businesses afloat. I think Florida's done it as well as anybody in the country, frankly, certainly of a state of this size.
Senador, regresando al tema de lo que está pasando ahora mismo en la administración de la Casa Blanca. Estamos viendo más estímulos que se están pasando, estamos viendo ahora el paquete que usted mencionó de la infraestructura, con 3 trillones de dólares que quieren incluir. Hay muchas personas que tienen un sentimiento de que lo que está pasando es algo radical, que fundamentalmente quieren cambiar a los Estados Unidos esta nueva administración. ¿Qué tú le puedes decir a esas personas que tienen esa preocupación?
Bueno, sin duda el plan que se pasó la última vez, un plan radical porque incluía una gran mayoría de los programas que estaban incluidos en esa ley, no tenían absolutamente nada que ver con el COVID. Nosotros hemos pasado, yo creo, 5 o 6 leyes bipartidistas para ayudar con el COVID. Yo fui autor de gran parte de varias de esas leyes. Y pudiéramos haber hecho otra vez una ley de nueva, pero en fin, ellos decidieron agregarle cosas a la ley que no tenían absolutamente nada que ver con el COVID y lo están haciendo, parece, otra vez en este tema de la infraestructura. Yo creo que si quieren trabajar de manera bipartidista vas a encontrar un gran apoyo para algo bipartidista, siempre y cuando sea sobre el tema que se está discutiendo. Si tratas de utilizar cada una de estas leyes como un vehículo para agregarle cosas adicionales que la extrema izquierda está pidiendo, pues vamos a tener problemas. Yo no puedo apoyar eso. The question was about the massive size of the stimulus programs. We've passed 5 or 6 bipartisan COVID plans. We could have passed another one. Again, they were all almost unanimous or voted with over 90 votes. I helped write significant portions of most of them when I was the chairman of the Small Business Committee. The last stimulus bill had a substantial amount of spending, a significant percentage of the programs that had nothing to do with stimulus. And the ones that did went too far. I mean, sending stimulus checks to people who are in prison. I mean, issues that had nothing to do with reality or dealing with the stimulus crisis, dealing with the COVID crisis. So I think if they want to do an infrastructure bill now that is about infrastructure, you can find a lot of support for that. If you want to add a bunch of stuff into it that's not infrastructure and call it infrastructure, then you're going to have opposition. They may still have the votes to pass it, I don't know, but it certainly won't be good for the country.
Hola, senador, pero hablando usted de la Casa Blanca y hablando del tema del Congreso, un elemento importante es el tema electoral, y usted ha estado en el ojo del huracán esta última semana. Vimos lo que ocurrió en Georgia, usted está en su estado natal, y por supuesto hablar del MLB, hablar de Delta, hablar de otras organizaciones que están también en el ojo del huracán. ¿Esto va a ser un efecto dominó? ¿Será que otras corporaciones en Estados Unidos se van a sumar para evitar que en el resto de los estados se den este tipo de iniciativas?
Yo no creo que ninguna corporación va a evitar nada. La legislatura de Georgia no va a cambiar su ley por presión de una compañía. Lo que te diré es que esas compañías están involucradas en una mentira. Están caracterizando una ley de manera que no es cierta. Si no quieren estar a favor de la ley, que no estén a favor de la ley. Pero lo están haciendo bajo una presión. Ellos sabían la realidad de esa ley y bajo presión pública de un grupo, de un elemento, han decidido pronunciarse públicamente. Y lo que me molesta a mí no es que hagan eso. Tienen todo el derecho del mundo de hacerlo. Lo que me molesta es la hipocresía. Porque tú no puedes ser Delta, o la NBA, o cualquier, que hace negocio con China, que no hay democracia, que está poniendo en campos de concentración a musulmanes por los miles, y no decir nada sobre eso, pero criticar un Estado donde los oficiales son electos, donde hay una democracia. Para mí es una hipocresía. Si lo vas a hacer, no hagas negocio con China tampoco, como hacen muchas de estas corporaciones, y no dicen ni una palabra sobre la realidad china. The question was about Delta, and these companies can opine whatever they want. What bothered me is 2 things. One, the hypocrisy. These are companies that make billions of dollars, or hundreds of millions of dollars, doing business with a communist regime in China that's guilty of atrocities, that's guilty of genocide. And they don't say a word. NBA doesn't say a word. Delta doesn't say a word when it signs its deal with China Air and its partnership with China, while they're putting Uyghur Muslims in camps, an issue that I've been talking about for 5 years. The second thing that bothers me is they know that what that law really does, but under public pressure from certain elements, they pronounce themselves in order to get this mob off their back. But the hypocrisy is what really bothers me.
So what is the law really do in your mind? You said what the laws were meant to do. You know, here in Florida, they're considering similar proposals which voting rights groups say could be restricted. So what do you mean?
But I don't. But that's a term, restrictive. What is restrictive about verifying that the person who signed it is the actual person who's registered to vote? Producing a photo ID. Many states already do that. The notion of already in Florida, you're not allowed to interact with voters within 100 feet of the voting lines anyway. We already have restrictions on voting. I don't believe that any of these things are restrictive. None of these things make it harder to vote. What they do make it is easier to verify that someone voted. And at the end of the day, every American wants to board an airplane has to show a photo ID. Every American, and there are many office buildings in America you can't go into, has to a photo ID. The debates we're having this week is whether people should be required to have a vaccine passport from the government to be able to go into a building or back to work. But for voting, if you ask to verify that's the person who voted, that's their identity, that's somehow restricted, I don't buy that idea. And the second thing that I know for a fact is Americans are, this idea that some people have that requiring someone to produce an ID is going to cause them from voting is absurd. It's not true. People are fully capable of being able to do it. They do it all the time. They do it when they buy cigarettes. They do it when they buy alcohol. They do it on a regular basis. And like South Carolina did, if IDs become cost prohibitive, they should be free for people that are of lower income.
Senator,
Absolutely.
When it comes to, I'm not sure if you saw the report on 60 Minutes last night. I did want to ask, though, do you believe, based on the public reporting that we've seen about the vaccine rollout in Florida, have you been at all concerned about this accusation that the governor set up what they're calling pay-to-play vaccine pods, that he sent them to areas that are friendly political areas in the state?
Well, I didn't see the report last night. I read something today about Publix.
But you've heard about.
Yeah, but I haven't seen that. But I've seen a lot of politics played with it. But I've heard the notion is, well, Publix gave a check, and so they got vaccines. The reason why Publix is doing it, I think, is because there's a Publix everywhere. That's why you want to have Publix do it.
Are you concerned that the governor?
No, I haven't seen any evidence. There's zero evidence that it's gone to special places because to benefit certain people. I think it's gone to places that have the ability to stand up one of these events and vaccinate people. It takes a certain logistical capacity to be able to do it. There's certain communities and certain organizations that have the infrastructure to do it. That doesn't mean it's only open to the people that live there. But especially in the early days before we had the retail program on board, like Walgreens and CVS and others, you had to have the logistical capability to be able to administer a vaccine in an orderly way to people in a way that didn't cause vaccines to be lost or spoiled and accounted for. And there were only a handful of organizations that could do that. And one of them was Publix because it happens to have locations all over the state.
Can you say a little bit about you expound more on that Major League Baseball commissioner and what you...
Yeah, I hope the commissioner is going to give up his membership in Augusta. That's a private members club with a deep history of discrimination and terrible things in its past. Are they going to now cut ties with the Chinese Communist Party? The answer to both is, of course, no, because it's easy to sort of just make a statement out there to appease an online mob, but giving up the privileges of having a membership in an exclusive club or making hundreds of millions of dollars with the Chinese Communist Party, that's a little harder to do. So that they won't do, and that's actually meaningful if they were to do that. Sí, aquí todos los días las personas en este país para comprar alcohol, cigarro, montar un avión, incluso entrar a muchos edificios, tienen que producir una identificación. Pero para votar no. Yo creo que una de las cosas más importantes en una elección es verificar que la persona que está votando es la persona que está inscrita para votar. Yo no creo que eso es un impedimento, eso es un requisito como existen para toda una serie de cosas en este país.
Senador, ¿cuánto cerca estamos en convertirnos en un país socialista con los cambios radicales que estamos viendo?
Yo creo que es un país donde hay dos problemas fundamentales. Una economía donde corporaciones pueden ganar mucho dinero sin producir trabajo para norteamericanos, para nuestro pueblo. Y número dos, un país donde un sector privado, no de gobierno, ha acumulado un poder social y político que tienen el poder ahora de controlar lo que uno puede decir, cuándo lo puede decir y quién lo puede escuchar. Y eso es un peligro para la libertad.
Back to the vaccines, today eligibility expands pretty much all adults, 16 up for Pfizer, 18. I know you got yours pretty early on, Senator. Just what's your message for Floridians who might be hesitant about this, and just what would you want to tell them about now that
There's no reason to be hesitant about the vaccine. None. I mean, it's now been administered to millions of people around the world without, any evidence of any sort of significant side effects. I think the minute your turn comes, or the minute you have an opportunity to have the vaccine, you should have it.
How much credit does the Biden administration get for really ramping up this well over the last couple of months?
Well, like I said, I think they've done a good job of continuing a program that was in place. I give them credit for having done it in a positive way, that you continue to see the production ramp up. And I think this is not an issue we should be playing politics with. This is an American achievement. It was American government investment that ramped up the private sector to create not one but now 3 vaccines that are available. It's American productive capacity that made it available. It's the Trump administration that began the rollout of it, and it's the Biden administration that's taken it to the next level. So this is a national achievement that we shouldn't politicize. And you'd be able to say, you can say anything you want about the response, but we've done vaccines better than any country of our size in the world. Whereas in Europe and Germany, and we wish them the best, obviously they're going through a tough time, they were going to lock down all of Germany last week for Easter.
Do you agree with Governor DeSantis' executive order banning vaccine passports?
Like I said last week, look, that's a combination of private property rights. Private property owners have a right to sort of decide what people can and cannot do in their own private property, versus a place that it's a public accommodation where you're inviting people in as customers and has to be open to everybody. I think that's a little bit more complicated in terms of requiring them to have a vaccine in that regard, because I do think there are people that have the freedom to decide not to be vaccinated and shouldn't be prohibited from lodging, from going into places that are essential for their livelihood. So again, it's an issue that I have to think a lot more about, because it's a new issue. It's not like we've ever had that exist before. But ultimately, I think we should all be somewhat uncomfortable with the notion that you're not going to be able to go certain places if you can't prove that you got a vaccine. But when it comes to private property, I mean, people have private property rights.
Will you, as far as the chip stacks go, will you ask for federal resources to come and take a look at the rest of the ones that are in the state?
Yeah, so right now the Environmental Protection Agency is there as an observer. So we're going to wait for this crisis to pass in the short term, and then we're going to learn more about whether there's a role for the federal government to play moving forward, or whether the state or county requires assistance from the federal government to do some of the things they want to do. I think that's, like I said, it's something we need to learn more about and hear more about on the ground. Right now everyone's kind of focused on the immediate crisis. Once it passes, there'll certainly be an opportunity to both learn from what the EPA saw and also what local authorities tell us they need.
How worried about what might actually happen to the bay?
Very worried. There's going to be a negative impact. There's no doubt about it. You're putting nutrients and contaminated water in a sensitive wildlife area. You're going to, we could see some bad stuff. Algae blooms, fish kills. It's not good. It's just not the catastrophic outcome. But this will not be a good outcome. This will be a terrible thing that's happened.
Senador, hablando de inmigración, el expresidente Donald Trump fue criticado por su discurso en torno al tema de la migración, pero más del 50% de la migración indocumentada se redujo. Ahora el presidente Biden está siendo criticado, pero por exactamente lo contrario. Más de 15.000 personas ingresando diariamente, 3.000 niños solos, siguen en estos lugares que por supuesto han sido ampliamente criticados. ¿Existirá realmente voluntad política bipartidista para darle punto, para cerrar este tema una buena vez por todas, o esto será un tema que vamos a vivir cada 4 años aquí?
Bueno, hasta que se controle la inmigración ilegal es imposible hacer una reforma migratoria, mientras que tengan una crisis andando. Hemos visto en los últimos días las cifras más altas en la historia de esa frontera moderna de personas llegando, muchos son niños, por la simple razón de que se mandó un mensaje de parte de esta administración cuando fue candidato y cuando entró a la presidencia, que las leyes iban a cambiar y que no iban a ser tan estrictos en enforzarlas. Y eso crea un incentivo para que las personas vengan, y lamentablemente vengan con niños, en un viaje sumamente peligroso que nadie debe tomar. Y hemos visto el resultado de eso. Primero, hasta que esté bajo control esta situación, va a ser imposible hablar de una reforma migratoria.
¿Cómo abordaría usted la solución?
La solución es lo mismo que yo he dicho ya hace casi 10 años. Empezamos con poner bajo control el problema de la inmigración ilegal. Segundo, modernizar nuestro sistema de inmigración legal para que no sea tan costoso, que tome tanto tiempo y que no sea tan complicado. Y tercero, entonces, después que se hagan esos 2 pasos, lidiar con la realidad que tenemos millones de personas en este país que no son criminales, que han estado aquí por mucho tiempo, que no han cometido ningún delito y que realmente no van a regresar a sus países, ya tienen sus vidas establecidas acá. Pero tiene que ser esos 3 pasos en esa orden.
We got time for one more question.
You can't possibly have anything outstanding.
I was going to say, you got to talk around 6 or 7.
Plan to go down and actually get your own eyes on the site of Piney Point while you're here?
Well, we thought about doing that today, but after talking to some of the people locally, I'm not sure there's a perfect. I mean, I think Vern Buchanan was doing a briefing at 12:30. I wasn't here on time for that. I just don't, at this point, want to go into a photo op. I mean, if there was somewhere for me to go and not be in the way, but at this point, we probably would just wait till after it passes. And you know, I called the commissioners today. I talked to the sheriff a little bit. I know they're dealing with it right now. The last thing they need to be doing is entertaining people coming in. So what we had made it for Vern's briefing. We would have liked to have gone to that. We couldn't figure out a time to get here fast enough to do it. But we're most certainly going to follow up with local authorities to figure out whether there is a federal role to play, not just in the aftermath of this and the impact it's going to have on wildlife, its short-term environmental implications, but what we need to do moving forward on this site and what other sites are there in the state that potentially pose a similar threat in the future. All right, guys, thank you.
Around 6 or 7, you know.
Well, you guys were running out of questions.